All right, as promised, I'd mentioned these memes in class, so I thought I would share it. Apropos of, we had a brief mention of Bolivia, and I had mentioned a meme that I saw to the effect of, well, if you have to explain it, it's not funny, I suppose, but, you get it here. And then, apropos of another comment that someone made about the word bourgeoisie or bourgeois being spelled, how it's spelled, or how many times Lenin mentions it. I had to do a little edit on this one. I did not make either of these memes, so I had to do an edit here to make it more appropriate. Um, Although I don't know if anything is appropriate about this image or teaching Lenin. I mean, to you all in particular. But here we go. So those are the memes I mentioned. So let's get into it. I'm going to talk about this. This little lecture is going to be on the Lenin reading and the Carol Pateman. They're not necessarily things that need to go together, but I'm putting them together because the readings were together. We discussed them briefly together. But I want to start with a little excursion into the field of semiotics. Um, and you'll see why in a second here. So, in semiotics or in linguistics, there's these ideas of a sign, a signifier, and a signified. So you have this comes to that little word Saussure. There's Ferdinand de Saussure was um, a linguistics, one of the early kind of pioneers of the field of linguistics in the early 1900s in France. Um, and he's a structuralist, but we can talk about that stuff later. So the idea is that like a sign, right? So like that thing, that apple, right, or that thing that you see is the sign, right? And then the signifier is the, as it says here, sound, word, image. So like the word apple, or like if you heard like the crunching of an apple as someone bit it, that could be like the signifier, or whatever, right? And then there's the signified, which is the mental concept. So for a long time, I was allergic to apples and I had a negative feeling about them. I'm not anymore. And I really like them, right? So the signified in my mind has changed significantly from when I was younger to now. I really enjoy apples now if they're crisp. If they're mealy, they suck. So anyway, the signifier and the signified combined, right, you get the sign. And I'll give you some more examples as we go through. So like, just for like, so dog, right? The word dog, or when I say dog, the thing you hear, that is a signifier. Um, the signified is the mental concept. When I think of dog, I think of my dog, right? If you have a dog, you might think of your dog. So the signifieds are going to be different for us, right? And then the sign is the idea of like, like a picture of a dog or something like that, right? So it's going to be a little different. But these things are important for the Lenin and for the Pateman and for a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about. This is a very interesting concept because there's this idea from this guy Ernesto Laclau of an empty signifier. And Laclau's kind of way of putting this is an empty signifier is a signifier without a signified. And that we can stop it there. I mean, you can read the rest of this if we want. But the idea of a signifier without a signified opens up some problems. And this is his book up here. I'm going to put my face over the book. You don't need to see it. That's the guy's name. Um, and I'm talking about this for a reason because the idea of an empty signifier, especially considering I've kind of retooled the course to talk about democracy and politics in light of the kind of current crisis that's happening in the United States. This is now November of 2020, if anyone's watching this in like, 2070 or something. That's what I'm talking about. So anyway, why am I bringing this up? Because these are all examples here of what we might term empty signifiers. Freedom, liberty, the 99%. The 1% is less an empty signifier because it has like a concrete, like if you make it a certain amount of money, right, you're in the 1%, where the 99%, like what does that mean, right? Who's in the 99%? The American people is something you'll hear a lot of politicians talk about. The American people want this or the American people want that. And you maybe hear a politician say that and you go like, well, I don't want that. So who are you talking about, right? And this gets at the idea of an empty signifier. So a concept like, say, liberty, right? That is a signifier, right? That we all understand. You go, oh, liberty, ooh, right? But your understanding of what that means might be different from my understanding of what that means. You could ask 10 random Americans what liberty means, and it could mean any number of things, right? It could be an abstract notion of freedom, and it could have someone could say something about the Constitution. Someone else could say something about taxes. Someone else could say something about sexual equality. Someone else could say something about legalizing drug use. You name it, right? So this is the idea of an empty signifier, because this is important for politics, because when you say the American people, the middle class is one I don't have on here, but everyone, oh, the middle class this, the middle class that. But what does it actually mean? If you get down to brass tacks and you talk about your definition and my definition, we're going to have some problems, right? Because we might have very, very different understandings of what that term means, right? So that is an empty signifier. And I bring this up because for this guy, the empty signifier is very, very important. The idea of the proletariat, right? So the proletariat in Marxist-Leninist ideology is very, very important, the proletariat. But what does that mean, right? What does the proletariat actually mean? Who is in it? It's supposed to be everyone, right? But some people make more money than others. Some people are unemployed. There's all kinds of different distinctions within the term proletariat. So it would be something we could call an empty signifier. And it is sometimes can be a little problematic, and we'll get into that. Okay, so Lenin. Lenin is a Marxist-Leninist, right? So just to give some context here, there's all kinds of different like socialism and communism, many, many different varieties. And Lenin's is obviously Marxist-Leninist. The Soviet Union was founded on Marxist-Leninist principles. Marxist-Leninist is not the same thing as Marxist, right? It's not the same thing as Trotskyism. It's not the same thing as utopian socialism or trade unionism or left communism or any other number of things. And the main thing, as we'll talk about here, is for Marxist-Leninism is the centrality of the state, right? The state is important in ushering in, right, communism or whatever, and all kinds of communists critique him for this. Okay, so, and you'll see here some of the distinctions that come out early on in his kind of career, his writing career, and then his political career. Couple big books: Imperialism, The Highest Stage of Capitalism, that's 1916. Obviously here the main focus is attacking capitalists. But in this book, he puts forward a couple important theories. The first is the idea of world revolution, that in order to set up the conditions for communism, you have to have it global. You can't have communism in just one country. This is something that Stalin later deviates from and says, forget it. You can just have communism here in the Soviet Union. The other key concept that comes out of Imperialism, The Highest Stage of Capitalism, is the idea of a vanguard party, that there's going to be leaders, natural leaders are going to emerge, and that's going to be the kind of vanguard party that is going to bring the people along with them, right? Educate the people, motivate the people, encourage the people. This is, in some ways, it's similar to what you may have heard, in APUSH or U.S. history with Du Bois's, W.E.B. Du Bois, the talented 10th, that there's a vanguard, a kind of a party in front, a group of people in front that bring everyone with them. The other big publication is Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. This is Lenin attacking other forms of communism, mainly left communism. So left communism is another kind of communism that's further to the left. It's more radical than what Lenin was proposing. And that was a big problem as Lenin is trying to create a government, right? I mean, it's interesting because it's the same thing. If you remember anything from U.S. history or APUSH, a similar thing happens in the United States, right? That like there's guys like Daniel Shays and the people who are in charge of the Whiskey Rebellion. There's people who want this more radical, like almost anarchic form of democracy. And the government says you can't do that anymore. This is something that Lenin is doing in the 1920s. There's people who want a more radical form of communism, more hands on, engaged, kind of like trade unionist communism. He says it's stupid. You can't do it. You got to have a state. You got to have laws. You got to have people who are in charge. And this is where he advocates for statist communism, where you need a state. Um, uh, 1920s, 1930s, it works out pretty well for the Soviet Union. You look at GDP going from like feudalism to pretty good in probably about 20, 30 years. So state communism works in that regard. Doesn't work in a lot of other ways, right? Total environmental destruction, right? Police state, political repression, all kinds of bad stuff, right? So in the end, Marxist Leninism, not a great track record there in the Soviet Union. Split between Stalinism and Trotskyism. We mentioned this briefly in class. Trotsky gets the bad end of that deal. And so into the reading. Bourgeois democracy. This is a critique of what, so the rights of man here, this is the French, right, penned partly by Jefferson and Lafayette. In the wake of the French Revolution, they write the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It's similar to the Declaration of Independence, and it affirms various values. These are what Lenin would call, and Marx also critiqued them, as bourgeois democracy, bourgeois values. That is to say that freedom, again, empty signifier, freedom means for the people writing that document, for the people in charge of at least the political side of the French Revolution. This isn't the sans-culottes or the poorest of the poor, right, out in the streets, but the people in charge of debating a new government. Their form of freedom means, property, private property. It means class mobility in an abstract way that isn't actually real. The sans-culottes are not becoming, right, the next Robespierre anytime soon. Voting, which actually doesn't do that much, right? The more radical elements of the French Revolution want a more engaged kind of plan. So the idea is that this stuff is just for the bourgeoisie, right? If you're saying partially what important part of freedom is like free enterprise, who does that benefit? People who engage in free enterprise. It doesn't benefit poor people, right? If you're saying part of freedom is private property, doesn't really help someone out who's like renting, right, or who doesn't have any private property. So this is Lenin's critique of bourgeois democracy. The idea of pure democracy, he throws this in there. It's just like it's a chimera. It's not real, right? It's a fake thing to get poor people to support your agenda. What he wants is a proletarian democracy, that is to say, rights and power in the hands of the workers, the real deal, right? So this is the real deal, says Lenin. The people, again, empty signifier here. Who are the people? It ain't the people that used to own the means of production, right? They're not included in the people because they're the bad guys or whatever. So the idea here is that for Lenin, the people control both the means of production and state power. That's proletarian democracy. Okay. Shifting gears, Carol Pateman, not a Leninist, right? But it's interesting to look at the ways in which what Pateman is saying is on some level, it has a little bit of what, in a very different and more radical way, Lenin is saying here. So for Pateman, she's a critic of liberal democracy. And when we say liberal democracy, we don't mean just like liberals. We mean like the modern understanding of liberal democracy. The United States is a liberal democracy. European nations are a liberal democracy, or at least for now, the United States is a liberal democracy. Who knows? So the idea here is, the criticism is, there's so much emphasis on contract, on free and equal partners coming together and making deals and making negotiating and people being obliged to do certain things, civic duty or whatever. She's a she critiques this and she says that um, it's not true necessarily, right? That if we like this stuff so much, then why don't we have more of it? Right? If we really like this so much, why don't we have more of it? And her issue with contract theory and obligation is that again, empty signifier. It papers over all kinds of inequalities. And for Pateman, it's mainly she's a feminist philosopher. For what she's focusing in on is the way women are not. It's not a free and equal partners when a woman enters the workforce or is looking for a partner or whatever, right? That there are certain patriarchy, class inequality, right, sexism, that these things are at play, and they negate the idea that anything is free and equal, and that a contract can in some way, and contract in the abstract sense, that a contract can in some way be among equals. Okay, Carol Pateman is not like Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov or Lenin, right? Very different. She's not saying anything like about seizing the means of production. She just wants more democracy. In some ways, Lenin wants less democracy. I mean, definitely wants less democracy. I mean, part of his criticism of the left comms or left communists is that they want more, like everyone should have a say in everything. And Lenin says that's stupid. Like that's an infantile disorder. It's the name of his book. Keep all this stuff in mind that I'm saying, because when we look at Benjamin Constant in the next video, you're going to see how all of this stuff ties together. What democracy means, who gets it, who doesn't get to have it. So Pateman says if democracy is so good, then why do we have so much of our lives governed by undemocratic principles, right? If we love democracy so much, then we should be trying to like tear down every kind of hierarchy there is, right? If it's about equality. If we love democracy so much, then why are we so protective of privilege? If we love democracy and equality so much, then how come we have all of these various parts of society that are exclusive, right? Or exclude others, that marginalize others? We should be like fighting against that stuff, Pateman says. And that's what she says we should do, right? That if you really want democracy and equality, you should fight for it, right? You should live that life, as they say, right? So to be a better democracy, we need to live more democratically. We need to actually not just, democracy is about going and voting every 4 years or 2 years, if you're really into it. But it should be about living an engaged democratic life in the workplace. Again, she's not saying seize the means of production, but she's saying there should be more. Why are we okay with such strict hierarchies, right? In the workplace. So that's Carol Pateman. We'll talk more about it in class. We talked a little bit about it already. Keep in mind this stuff because in the next video on Benjamin Constant, I'm going to talk about the difference between the liberty of the ancients and the liberty of the moderns and what the distinction is. And hopefully you'll see how in what Lenin is trying to say and what Pateman is trying to say, you have two different versions of trying to play with this idea of what is liberty, what are rights, how do you live a kind of democratic life in the modern world? How did they do it in the ancient world? And what are the examples of people trying to recreate it, right, from then to now? More on that in the next video.